have a measure of discipline. They want them to have a clear sense of where they're going and what they're about. But I must say, I find it rather sad that any of these obvious debates that you get between different political movements and political parties becomes an object of sort of negative comment. I can see you could say maybe, well, isn't this a tension in how a newly independent Scotland might negotiate its position? Because I think it is a tension, and one that, in line with what you were saying there, Stuart, has a degree of uncertainty around it which can't really be eliminated. But equally, of course, it cuts back the other way on the Better Together territory. I mean, we're only going to see a ramping up of disagreement between the participants in Better Together campaign about the fate of the UK. The UK economy, the UK politics in general as we come up to 2014. And I will obviously await for the same ridiculous requirement that the Labour Party agrees with the Tories and the Tories always agree with the Lib Dems. Because that's what the argument is, isn't it?
Yes, it is. On the subject of disagreeable politicians, or disagreeing politicians, George Osborne came up to Glasgow to give us all a good dressing down recently. What did you make of that, Stuart?
Mr. Osborne, like Mr. Cameron, always welcome to come north and deliver messages that are clearly tailored for audiences in his home constituencies. I found his intervention, it just demonstrated a complete lack of awareness of the Scottish landscape that almost but not quite trumped David Cameron coming up to Scotland to ride on a Trident submarine.
I'm still a fan of the Porridge Factory from before. But,
yes, yeah,
but it was amazing to me that he just came up. It was so kind of colonial almost. I don't mean to bring in someone's upbringing for it, but I think George Osborne was probably born with a silver spoon rammed up somewhere the sun doesn't shine. And he has that sort of sense of entitlement that he can just come up and tell the locals how it should be, and this kind of imperialist mentality. We're going to go sort out this local trouble. These little boys shouldn't be giving us problems. We're going to threaten them, and that's exactly what they did. It was a threat, and I find that extraordinary that the Scottish media didn't really pick up on that. He came up to Scotland and he threatened the Scottish public, and nobody said anything.
Well, I would say to begin with, I'll get to your point in a minute, Michael, but we shouldn't forget that David Cameron is significantly more popular than the Conservative Party is in Scotland, if you follow the polls, which I always think is an interesting thing. I think there's... George Osborne's intervention is curious because the SNP's currency position on sterling, as I understand it, serves a number of functions. Its first one is simply to say, pragmatically, this is the best option for Scotland, whose economy is quite closely entangled at the moment with the rest of the United Kingdom. The second point, though, I detect in it anyway, is that it exemplifies something that you've heard from the SNP quite a lot about how Scotland and England would become good neighbours rather than surly lodgers after independence. And it's a good example of that. We'd cooperate on this. We'd cooperate on currency in the mutual best interests of both Scots and folk who live in England and Wales. The problem with this is, though, that it relies on your negotiating partner being up for it. And I think, as Stuart said earlier, there is a difference between how you might conduct this debate if you were negotiating with independent Scotland, say you were George Osborne, and how you might represent your behaviour in the context of a debate about whether Scotland should be independent. And the problem is that no one can sort of say to George Osborne, well, come 2016, you would really negotiate, wouldn't you? You would be up for a currency union. And he can say, no, I wouldn't be. We wouldn't do it. And you wouldn't have the pound, and you'd be jiggered. Your best laid plans would be ruined. And that's clearly a strategy rooted in the campaign rather than in the kind of post-independence situation, I think. But it's very difficult to rebut for the SNP, I say, except to say that he's just not being realistic, that he's threatening you. I would say there may be a wee risk in it, though, which maybe picks up on what you were saying, Michael, which is the fact that you like Scotland so much, you want Scotland to be so much part of your political union, that if you don't do what we say, then we're going to totally shaft you. I mean, that's essentially, as I perceive it, the context of George Osborne's observation. So there's a kind of...
Sorry, wasn't that actually the context of signing the union as well?
Oh, let's not get into that. I mean, let's not stray. I always think 1707 is best avoided where possible in the context of the independence debate. But I think there's a wee bit of negativity, a bit of steel in the middle of it, which sort of says, well, actually, if you don't do what we want, then you can bugger off. But equally, though, on the other side, why should we expect the rest of the UK to play along nicely when we're no longer part of the national interest as they perceive it? I suppose that's a question some people might ask themselves in the context of any future negotiations on independence. Why should we assume that the rest of the UK will play ball on these questions, and why should the SNP get away with assuming it?
I agree with that, and that's also a good reason for having your own currency, or at least having in mind the plan. Why should you expect that they will play fair? Not necessarily play fair, but obviously they'll do like any state and pitch to get the best they can for themselves.
If I might jump in there, the best they can for themselves is, frankly, to have Scotland in a currency union. There's compelling economic arguments for our UK to, and our UK is rump UK, not our UK. I just want to make that very clear. Our UK would be as beneficial to them as it will be to us to share a currency.
Even if that's true, isn't this a problem primarily not of economic policy and optimal currency unions between two different countries, as we may be after 2016? But isn't it a question about perception in the campaign? And I think it's difficult for the SNP and for Yes Scotland to combat George Osborne's position effectively.
Well, I think it is entirely possible for us to combat his argument, because his argument is it's part of a pattern. It's part of, here's a big bucket of uncertainty, here's some fear, have it. But I'm not entirely sure how well thought through. If I was on the other side, I'm not entirely sure how much I would welcome that message being delivered by George Osborne. The point about Cameron that you made, Andrew, is a very good one, that he is quite a personable politician. He does come across quite well. Speaking as someone who is diametrically opposed to just about everything the chap stands for. But Osborne isn't exactly liked or respected and doesn't have a great track record. And I'm just fascinated to know what they thought they were getting out of that. And for me, it sounds a lot more like a Tory politician who needs to play to his home constituency down south, his main constituency, his base down south, coming up here and talking tough. I'm not entirely sure.
But why do you think that is the case, though, Stuart? Because I was struck by that point, and I wanted to ask you that. Why, in a sense, what is the base he's speaking to, and what, in your perception, does he get out of this tough intervention, except for a few supportive Telegraph blogs from Ian Martin, formerly of The Scotsman?
Yeah, I know Ian. I used to work for him. But I mean, what he gets is precisely what you've outlined, which is some positive media coverage, which is as rare as hen's teeth in his Osborne's experience. But I am slightly positive as to what the No Campaign Up Here felt that did for them. I mean, I know that they are quite wedded to an entirely understandable strategy of throwing up uncertainty and throwing fear and making it look threatening. I'm just not sure that George Osborne's the right messenger to get that across.
Just to pick up on something you said, Stuart, the currency union would be in the best interest, but there's the best interest of our UK. But there's an assumption there that states always act from rational self-interest, and I kind of hinted at it. But you would expect them to do that, but there's also cases when they don't. Isn't there the possibility that there's kind of what Andrew's saying? There'd be a sense of we're the master of this and hang the best outcome.
Well, yes, I mean, we assume that they are indeed rational actors, but I think that's a reasonable assumption that when it comes to, once the argument is settled, if Scotland votes yes, then we'll be in the negotiation phase where, especially in the current economic crisis, no government that ever wants to be re-elected is going to behave in a way that looks rash or indeed spiteful on the economic front. Remember, the strengths go two ways. There are important economic reasons for the rest of the UK, for Scotland to remain in the currency union. It's not just a one-way street. It's not just about us coming to them and begging. There are various levers that Scotland will deploy in its negotiations.
And on the subject of rational actors, there's been a lot of discussion this week that things have just got a little bit nasty, finally. People were expecting it to come, and there's been sniping for a long time. But around the Susan Calman story and other things, there's been a lot of talk this week that finally things are just getting a little bit unfair and over the top. I suppose I'd go to Stuart with that first. What do you think about this and the Susan Calman story?
The Susan Calman story makes me quite angry. I mean, I think she made some jokes about Scottish independence. I think she's quite funny. I can take a joke. if people respond in an aggressive or hostile way to her, I'd ask them how they think that helps us persuade our fellow Scots to vote yes. We have to be the positive campaign. We have to be the optimistic campaign. We have to be the approachable campaign. We have to be the engaging campaign. We have to be the likeable campaign. We are the ones who have a job to do to convert other people. And you don't do that by shouting and screaming at them. Full stop.
Strangely, the Scotsman, they had one story, and then they had a kind of one story about death threats and things, and then it later changed to a kind of much more watered down and more calm version of the same events. Did you notice that?
Yeah, for me, the media is the media, and we know where it is. We know where the Scotsman stands, and we know what the Scotsman will do. And really, my concern is around how we, as the Yes movement, how we can ensure that our supporters behave in a way that we can all be proud of, in a way that is not going to get picked up by the media. So, if it's a case of, if you see somebody who's behaving in a way that's inappropriate, then take them aside and have a word with them. I hear what you're saying about the media coverage. I know exactly what you mean, but the bottom line is we can't behave in a way that gives people the chance to portray us as screaming cybernats.
I understand that because the accusations that will come if there is, but don't mean in the sense of unnecessary personal attacks that go on. But in general, I'll come to Andrew in a minute about the Calman story, but in general there's an idea, and it's gaining a lot of currency. In the last interview I did with Stuart Braithwaite from Mogwai, he brought it up, and many other people have as well, that there's a kind of feeling that Yes Scotland official campaign's being too nice. Like his suggestion was that they should have posters and I made a mock-up of it, sorry, but we should have just a big picture of Boris Johnson saying this man's probably going to be the next prime minister of the UK. Vote yes, and I made one up just to make the point. What do you think about the suggestion that so far Yes Scotland have been being too nice?
I would recommend that you take a read of Stephen Noon's blog on why we are so positive and why we are so optimistic. You can find it on National Collective. Essentially, if you have two negative campaigns, the most negative one wins. If you have a negative campaign and a campaign that's negative and positive at the same time, the most negative one wins. If you have a campaign that's entirely positive and a campaign that's entirely negative, the positive one wins. The way we behave is not an accident. The way that Yes Scotland conducts itself is not haphazard. We are deliberately positive. We don't want to get on to discussing the latest accusation that is thrown at us, whether it's from the No campaign, whether it's from a Tory politician, whether it's from a leader column in the newspaper. We are about demonstrating to the people of Scotland that there is a fantastic opportunity of a lifetime being offered to them, and we have to basically talk past the media and over the media, which is why digital is so important to us, to reach people with our genuinely grassroots campaign and our positive message. Because if it descends into a negative mudslinging match, people are turned off by that. And I hear exactly what you're saying, and I'd love to see a mocked-up poster. And who knows, there might be an optimistic fairy dust version of it that we put out. But the bottom line is people are turned off by negative politics. It appeals to those of us who are kind of sort of political train spotters. It doesn't appeal to the kind of voters that we at Yes Scotland need to reach. We need to reach out to people who are not engaged in politics. We need to reach out to people who are turned off by all that stuff, and we do it in a very different way. Absolutely understand entirely why people feel that, you should be doing this or you should be doing that. But there are very, very, very strong strategic reasons why we don't get down in the mud. And it's not that we're holding off for the right moment to go negative. We won't go negative.
Okay, very interesting. Susan Calman's story. Andrew.
Well, I don't know enough about the sort of underlying empirical basis for her problems. I'm sure she's telling the truth as she sees it. I've never persuaded anyone of anything when I began by telling them that I thought their background was dubious, or their past choices were moronic, or their former allegiances were suspect. I always find that people are best persuaded when you listen to them. When you ask them, well, what particularly is causing you anxiety, and then you treat that with respect. I'm not saying that people online should always be nice about each other, because often people aren't trying to persuade their nearest neighbour by commenting on a moronic piece in the Daily Mail. You're just wanting to say, this is moronic.